This morning, we're looking at the idea that there's a time in our lives when enjoyment becomes emptiness. And according to the Scriptures, futility needs to meet fear when that happens. Now, I explain as we go. But I'll just make a comment. You know, last fall and I joked earlier about Cubs and whatnot. Last fall, several people became temporary Cub fans for the sake of me. Some of you became antagonizers for the sake of me too. But nonetheless, the question was asked, well, what's it feel like to be world champions? And I think probably a lot of people were surprised at my response because, yes, I enjoyed that night when they won the game. But I got to tell you that I knew going in that it wasn't going to be the absolute thrill of victory and the sense of, okay, I've reached it now. I'm there. I knew that was going to be the case. Because I'd experienced many times, countless times throughout my life, when certain hope-fors end up not being quite as exciting as what you expected. Because that's the way life is. And there are times when we say, I can't wait for, and when we get there, it's like, well, yeah, it happened. And we could list any number of things that fit into that. But now I ask a question here, and I want to be quick in this introduction. What's my source for finding fulfillment? And as I ask that question, does your source for fulfillment, does it provide real satisfaction? Or is it only going to be temporary? You're going to have to go back and get another fix later. Because I think it's important that we realize that oftentimes the source that we have for fulfillment is not necessarily going to provide for us permanent gratification. And therefore, my second question, how strong is my desire? How intense is my desire for gratification? Have we learned the lesson that oftentimes many of the things that gratify us, that satisfy us, that these things are, well, they're temporary. And they're not as fulfilling as what we might think. And I think we need to be objective and careful about recognizing this reality. And I've got plenty of personal illustrations and specific illustrations we can look at as we go through this message, but I want to get you thinking now. How strong, how intense is each of our desire for gratification? Thirdly, when is contentment a positive and when is it a negative? I was taught by some people growing up, not my parents, but I was taught that contentment is always a problem because it makes us lazy. I don't believe that's necessarily the case. In fact, when I read in 2 Timothy and 1 and 2 Timothy what Paul writes to Timothy about contentment, it's interesting to notice how he talks about how there's a contentment in godliness. But when is contentment, that sense of contentment, when is it a positive part of our lives and when does it become a negative part? When does it develop laziness? And finally, I think it's vital that we realize that throughout life we've always got to be overcoming the treadmill effect. I've referred to that already. The sense of temporary gratification. The sense of it doesn't fulfill as much as I expected. And where do I get this idea? Well, from Solomon. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, he writes and says, vanity of vanities, or futility of futilities, or emptiness of all emptiness. That's what the Hebrew word means. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. He says in another portion of Ecclesiastes, nothing changes under the sun. And I think we have to understand that life can be a treadmill. And I'll just comment, and I don't want to go long on this, but I just have to say, there's a growing ideology out there. There's a growing perspective out there by many, many people, especially some in the younger generation, that says, I've always got to be changing. I've always got to be finding something new. I've always got to have a different job. You know, people in our generation, my generation, most of the time they've had just a few jobs in their life. I've got young people that I know that have had more jobs in their life than I've had, and they've only been working for a few years, and I've been working for over 40. It's treadmill effect. I've got to find fulfillment. I've got to find satisfaction. I've got to find gratification. And I think that's a key element of the way life is. Now, as I say this, and again, I want to be quick because I've got some great content in this message today. But the cultural context of where this is going, we ask the question, where does God, where does an act of faith in God, where does church attendance or church involvement fit within the priority structure of people in our culture? Where does it fit? How high is it on the... Because if we notice, as the culture has changed as far as the treadmill effect is concerned, something else has changed, and that is that there has been less and less focus on the priority of God, of faith in God, of involvement in church ministry, to the point where, if we look historically speaking, we go back about 175 years, and we would find that it appears as if the popularity of God has been declining here in America since that time. In Europe, it's been declining longer than that. But the popularity of God has been declining in American culture. There are various social trends, values, and viewpoints that indicate many apparent attempts to eliminate the idea and the importance of God. I hope we all realize that Darwin was not a scientist. And Darwin didn't know much of what he was talking about scientifically, because what he determined was basically to meet his need to eliminate God from the structure. His sexual mores were so perverted that he needed to eliminate God from the structure because it made him feel guilty. And that was, like I say, in the neighborhood of 175 years since that. And what we need to recognize is how much this influences the way that we think and how we live our lives. It affects all of us. And based on another poll by Barna, this is straight from Barna's website. I live on that website some weeks. But some of their most recent data, approximately 38% of Americans are active churchgoers. That's higher than I thought it was going to be, but approximately 38% are active churchgoers. But get this, 43% of Americans are unchurched. No church involvement. And around 1/3 of Americans have left the church and have stopped their participation completely. And this divide between the religiously active and those resistant to church-going, it impacts our culture, our morality, our politics, and our religion. So we dig in. We dig in and see what Solomon has to show us. A lesson from Solomon. Notice the split heart there. Solomon had a divided heart. He had a heart that said faith and faithfulness, they're important. He was told that. We'll see that in a moment. But he also had this perspective that says, fame and fortune, man, I love it. And I want all the fame and fortune I can possibly get. And his heart was divided. And as we consider what Solomon was, realize that he was a man blessed with abundant wisdom. That wisdom was from God. And he wasted much effort seeking fame, fortune, and fulfillment. In the very end of his life, it appears that he stepped back to acknowledge his mistakes. And he wrote to express both his regrets on one hand and his requests on the other. His regrets were late in life and pointed out some huge mistakes that he'd made. His requests involved or reminded us that we can learn from his mistakes. So what do we see first? And these first sections here, this is still, it's not introduction, but yet it's context. It's something we need to see as we try to dig into what Solomon is showing us and telling us. Because his assignment. What was Solomon's assignment? What was he supposed to do? We see from his dad, King David, speaking. This is when Solomon became king, where David says to Solomon, follow the instructions and the commands of the Lord your God. That's what you need to do, Solomon. That's your responsibility. That's your assignment. To walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies. Do these things according to what is written in the law of Moses, so that you can be successful in all that you do and wherever you turn. And that's from 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. That's a summary of that section. And that's Solomon's assignment. Secondly, Solomon's account. We look at the end of his life. We look at what is said about him at the end of his life, and it's not particularly happy. Because we find in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 11, or 1 through 13, one or the other, 1 through 13, we find where it says, now the Lord was angry with Solomon. Why? Because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you've done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. That's the account at the end of Solomon's life. God was angry with Solomon. Solomon's autobiography, what's he say about it himself? Let me just comment. I studied the book of Ecclesiastes as much as any Old Testament book, probably more than many, because I wrote my dissertation. When I finished my degree, I wrote my dissertation on the book of Ecclesiastes. I found it to be an intriguing book. And that book was written by Solomon at the end of his life to show, you know what, I blew it, he says. I blew it, and this is what you can learn from me, he's saying. And here he is in chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. It's not all the verses, it's a summary of it once again, where he writes, I, the preacher, he calls himself the preacher. Why? Because he's writing this book of God's Word, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with, he says. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there is much grief. And increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Isn't that a sad autobiography? Amen? Now, a brief analysis of his life, and then we're going to dig in and see some of the specifics of what we find in our study today. What was Solomon? A brief analysis of his life. What was he? Who was he? He was the third king of Israel. He reigned during Israel's golden era. David brought more prosperity and more goodness to Israel than any other king. And Solomon took over from his father. Solomon was noted for his God-given wisdom and his diplomacy. The God-given wisdom was one thing, his diplomacy was another. He was extraordinarily wealthy. richer than anybody could ever imagine. He was the original builder of the temple. The original temple was built under Solomon's leadership. He wrote portions of 4 books of the Bible. And his divided heart resulted in a divided kingdom, because after Solomon was no longer king, after he died, Israel split in 2. His divided heart ended up in a divided kingdom. So that's what we find. Now, as we look at Solomon's adventures, this is where we're digging in, and we're finding some truths that we're going to look and see what is the application for our lives. This is where we find some conclusions that are so important, because what are Solomon's adventures? What did he tell us in that autobiography when he continued to write? Well, he tells us exactly all the things that he did, and he's pointing them out as a way of saying, these are my mistakes. Because one of the first things that happened was he was going for the gusto. And it says here in this passage, this is Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 11, once again a summary. He says, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow maybe we'll die, he's saying in a certain sense. Behold, it too was futility. We're going to define that more specifically in a little while. He asked the question, what does this accomplish? All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I went after anything I wanted and I got it. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity, emptiness, and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. So he went for the gusto. He was going for the gusto, and he says, boy, that worked well. Secondly, he says, I tried to focus on folly. He said, I had all the wisdom in the world, and yet I focused on foolishness. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. The word folly, you know what the Hebrew word is? It's moron. Moronic. Foolishness. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? I believe that Solomon is realizing that he had this responsibility, this assignment that God gave, and if he failed in that assignment, that what would follow after him wasn't going to be a happy situation. So he says, who knows what the man will do that comes after me? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. He says, so I hated life. For the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futile. Everything is futility, and it's grasping for the wind. Once again, that got him real far. Or thirdly, he expresses how he was, in a sense, in his life, he was forsaking the fruit of his labors. You see in chapter 2, verses 18 through 21, this is almost verbatim. He's, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. For I must leave it to the man who will come after me. All this that I've done, and I have nothing to show for it. Who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? I can't control that. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity, he says. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. Solomon speaking. I despaired of all that I'd done. I figured, what is the use? And therefore, what's happening here in the end, he's feeling the frustration. Feeling the frustration where he says in chapter 2, verse 22 and 23, "For what does a man get in all his labor, and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest." This too is vanity. And I think it's vital for us to get the principle here. Most people seek fulfillment in things that lead to futility. Especially as our culture becomes more and more secular. Most people are seeking fulfillment in things that will only lead to futility, to emptiness. And that's Solomon's adventures. That's where he took us, or that's where he went, and he takes us through that story, and he basically says, all is vanity. It's futile. And he's saying, be careful, the fulfillment that you seek is probably in something that's only going to land in futility. And we see that even more as he gets to chapter 3, Solomon's appraisal of the whole situation. He shows us specifically, this is what I've concluded. This is where I'm headed. And as I conclude this, I've learned some lessons, and basically he's saying, I want to teach others. I want to show others the lessons that I've learned, because the first lesson he learned was God's faithfulness. He says, God is faithful. In fact, how many of y'all remember the song written and sung by the Byrds years ago? To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a turn, turn, turn. And a purpose for every under heaven. All right. Solomon we look at this, and we could read it all, and I'm not going to because it just takes more time than what I really feel I can take this morning. Because you know it. You can look at it yourself. He says there's an appointed time. This is verse 1 of chapter 3. There's an appointed time for everything. God's in control. And there is a time for every event under heaven. God has everything so ordained. There's a time to reap. There's a time to sow. There's a time to laugh. There's a time to cry. There's a time for this. There's a time for that. All the way through the first 10 verses of chapter 3. First 8 verses, I'm sorry. Because then in verse 9 he says, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? Because I have seen the task which God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves, he says. He says, God has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart. In the heart of man, God has set eternity. Yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. God has mysteriously established a time for everything. He's placed eternity into our hearts, into our minds, into our lives. He's given us a time clock. But the reality is, we don't know specifically or precisely when this is going to happen or when that's going to happen. That's in God's hands. But he says God is faithful. That's the first of the things that he is concluding here. That's the first part of his appraisal as he looks back at his life. God is faithful. Secondly, our focus is important. Our focus is important, where he writes, and he says in verse 12 of chapter 3, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in his labor, sees the purpose in his labor, sees what God desires in his labor, because it is the gift of God. It is God's gift to us. Labor is a gift. It's a blessing. Verse 14, I know that everything that God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There is nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that man should fear Him. That man should fear Him. So our focus is that labor is a blessing. And He has given us responsibilities and tasks and things to do. Why? So that we can honor Him, so that we can fear Him in the proper ways. But next we find in Solomon's writings here in chapter 3, in verse 16, our failures. The fact is, there's a sinfulness that is pervasive in our failures. He says, furthermore, I've seen under the sun that in the place of justice, when mankind takes over, when he tries to do justice, what does he do? He brings wickedness into the formula. And in the place of righteousness, there is wickedness. He's saying the sinfulness of mankind has tainted most everything that goes on. But yet we look back and say, God has so worked that we should fear Him. God has provided in such a way, He is faithful forever. Our future. Our future. Verse 17, I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. Everyone will face judgment from God. For a time for every matter and for every deed is there. Skipping down to verse 20, he says, all go to the same place. That's death. That's the grave. All came from the dust and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beasts descend downward to the earth? It says in Hebrews, it is given to man in accountability, and all will die once. So he's basically saying the future is death's in our future. Death's in the future. And he's expressing that, and what's he saying then in the conclusion? Our faith is the difference. Our faith is the difference in the whole prospect, in the whole situation. He says, verse 22, I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy. I'll define happy in a moment here. Happy in his activities, for that is his lot. Who will bring him to see what will occur after him? That's a rhetorical question. Who is it that helps us put things in perspective? Who is it that will show us what's right? Who is it that will provide the afterlife that is a blessing? Now the word happy there, it's a difficult translation because I see where many of the Bible translations have translated it that way, but literally the Hebrew word means to rejoice and find pleasure in it because God is understood as the source of it. That's what the Hebrew word means there. To rejoice and find pleasure because you recognize God is the giver of all happiness. God is the giver of all positive. And our faith in God is the difference, he says. And I go back to what I read just a little bit ago. Our faith is the difference, where he says, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. And I know that everything that God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There is nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear Him. And what do we find in this? Principle number 2. The fear of the Lord provides for us a path, or the path, not a path, the path towards fulfillment. That's what Solomon's saying right here. The fear of the Lord provides for us the path, the only path towards fulfillment. If we think we're going to find fulfillment anywhere else, we are mistaken. We're wrong. And Solomon came to realize that in the midst of everything he had and all that he did, he came to realize that I've got the world by the tail. I've got everything. I've got wisdom. I've got wealth. He found out that his pursuits were fruitless, frustrating, foolish, failing, and futile. Solomon was pursuing after things that were fruitless. They had no profit. There was no profit under the sun. They were frustrating because he says, whoa, I don't know what's going to happen after I'm gone. They were foolish. He recognized the failures, and he recognized the futility. And then thirdly, the third principle here, we have to understand that discernment guards against futility. Discernment guards against futility, and the fear of the Lord is what gives us discernment. Discernment guards against that sense of emptiness, that sense of futility. And the fear of the Lord is that which gives us discernment. And as we look at that, we realize that Solomon had been abundantly blessed by God. He'd been unbelievably blessed by God, but yet his lifestyle was out of control. And he lost sight of God. So that brings us to our last section, Solomon's advice for us. His advice for us comes from Ecclesiastes 2, 3, 5, and 12. We find in chapter 2 where he writes and says, there is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen that it is from the hand of God. The labor, the fruit, all of it, it's from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without Him? No one. For to a man who is good in his sight, He has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner He has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to the one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity, futility, and striving after wind. Or the next section, chapter 3, verse 14. We read this a little bit ago, where Solomon writes, I know that everything God does will remain forever. If God did it, it's certain. It's done. It's forever. There is nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear Him. Or chapter 5, verse 7, where he writes, he says, for in many dreams, in many words, there is emptiness, there is futility. Rather, fear God. Or finally, the last two portions that he wrote in chapter 12, where he expresses, he says, the conclusion when all has been heard is this: fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every single person. For God will bring every act to judgment. Everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. I want to explain this. That word futility, that word vanity, vanity of vanities, for all is futility. It's the same Hebrew word. It's a word that literally it means vapor. It means vapor. It's translated vanity, it's translated chasing after the wind. But he's talking about emptiness. This type of fulfillment, this type of striving after whatever that has a secular focus, it leads to emptiness, limited but not lasting satisfaction. Limited but not lasting satisfaction. We might get some joy out of it. Did I enjoy the World Series victory? Yes, I did. But then this season happened and they haven't played so well. You can laugh. Maybe it's not funny. But where does futility lead? In Solomon's life, it led to despair. It led to a defeated perspective. It led to depression. It led to the fact that he was deflated about life. He was discouraged. It led to discontentment. Futility. The other end of the spectrum, fear. God has so worked that man would fear Him. The fear of the Lord is this, and this is from my study on the book of Ecclesiastes, my study of the book of Proverbs in preparation for my dissertation on Ecclesiastes. In fact, I've studied over and over and over again the term, what is the fear of the Lord, all the way into 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And what I've determined in a way that to me is easy to remember, maybe it isn't for you, I don't know. Found out a couple weeks ago when I said I wasn't using something catchy, that a couple people say I like that better. So I'll just say this morning. This is the way I best remember the fear of the Lord. It is respect for God's position. Respect for who He is and where He sits. Respect for the fact that He is the sovereign God over everything. Secondly, it's reverence for His presence. Everywhere I go, God is there. There's nothing I do that God doesn't see. There's nothing I do that God doesn't know. So I respect His position. I have reverence for the fact that, God, You're always there. And finally, I am consistently relying on His provisions because I can't do it on my own. And if you study through Proverbs, you study through Ecclesiastes, you study through other wisdom literature in the Psalms and whatnot, you study through some New Testament passages, and you'll find that every single passage will lead you to the perspective that the fear of the Lord is respect for who He is, His position. It's reverence for His presence with us moment by moment, day by day, and it's relying on the fact that He's provided everything that we need. And it leads to faithfulness, it leads to fruitfulness. It leads to fulfillment if we actually strive after fearing the Lord. It leads to a focused lifestyle that says, I'm going to follow God. It leads to us being functional in serving Him. You know, I got to tell you, I see it, and I get calls regularly. I guess I've been around just long enough, I've been involved in enough ministries, that I get calls from other churches for advice and for questions. And I just got to tell you, there's an awful lot of dysfunction out there. I think most of this dysfunction revolves around the fact that we don't fear God the way we ought to. We don't follow His directions the way we ought to. And it enables us to be a follower. Our fourth principle, and then I'm going to take just a couple moments to express some other thoughts to make this very, very personal this morning. Our fourth principle is discernment is often a result of learning from other people's mistakes. And Solomon is a prime example. Why in the world would anybody write about himself and tell everybody what a lousy job he did in certain areas? He did it because God said, that's what I want you to do, Solomon. This is how you close it off. This is how you end well. By telling everybody what you did wrong and telling them what they need to do to correct that. So discernment is often a result of learning from other people's mistakes. Now let's make this super personal this morning. Some action items from this particular passage. The first thing we need to ask ourselves, am I teachable and receptive to truth that could help me? Do I have a soft heart? Am I teachable and receptive to the truths that can make a difference in my life? I know there's no room on the notes for this because God gave me this last night in my sleep. He woke me up in a certain sense, and I realized that I needed to add something real personal to this if I had time. That's why I hurried so much today. Am I teachable and receptive to the truth that could help me? We look at the conclusion of this passage. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God. Keep His commandments, because this applies to every one of us. For God will bring every act of judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So 2 questions revolve from that. Do my actions and attitude show that I have respect and reverence for God and that I rely on Him? Do my actions and attitude show that I fear Him? Second question, do I have any personal areas of sin that cause a problem for me or for those people around me that have to live with me? Do I have areas of sin in my life that need to be dealt with? This gets real personal. My prayer this morning is that revival could break out in our midst. Because when we look at that, 3 areas I want to consider. Do I sin with my mind? They're all M's, by the way. Do I sin with my mind? Do I have thought life problems? What does sinning with my mind involve? It involves inappropriate ideas about myself or others. It involves lusts or evil desires, whether they be sensual, sexual, or selfish. It involves hatred, jealousy, or uncontrolled anger. It involves arrogance or pride that builds up in our lives. Oh, I'm better than him, so I must be okay. It involves stubborn about obedience or submission to God. Am I stubborn in saying, yes, Lord? It involves thoughts controlled by society and not controlled by the Spirit. Do I sin with my mouth? That involves lying, deceptive, or false statements. That involves gossip or slander. That's saying unkind or unnecessary things about others, whether they're true or false, either one. That's manipulative statements or flattery. Oh, you look so nice today. It involves vulgar, obscene, or vain language. And it involves one thing I'm good at, talking too much. Not enough listening. Now, I will say this. I may talk a lot, but one thing God's taught me over the last number of years, I'm amazed at how poor of a listener that I was at one time in my life. And God has convicted me. God has chiseled on me. God has just reshaped me. And boy, the chisel hurts sometimes. But I've learned to listen. Can I tell you a secret? I never think of my response to somebody until I know they're done talking. Because when we're thinking of our response to someone before they're done talking, we're not hearing them. In fact, if I ever do that to you, catch me on it. Finally and last, and I know this is stretching, but do I sin with my money or materials? That involves poor spending habits that waste dollars. That involves selfishness and refusing to help those in need. That involves failing to honor the Lord through giving dollars for church and missionary ministries. That involves hoarding or becoming materialistic. That involves worshiping money or things more than we worship God. Simple question here at the end. What would the Lord want from me? What would the Lord want from me? Let's pray. Father, I just want to ask you to work. You've convicted me over and over and over again in different areas. And I know that you convict others too. I know that you've worked in life throughout the history of mankind in such a way that we would be drawn to fear you, to respect your position, to have reverence for your presence, to rely upon your provisions for our lives. You want us to do a checklist every once in a while, Father. I know that. I know you want us to look closely at our lives and ask ourselves, are there areas where I'm failing to deal with things the way I'm supposed to? Do I sin with my mind? Do I sin with my mouth? Do I sin with my money or my materials? Father, I pray that not one of us this morning would step back and look at someone else and say, boy, they need to work on this. But instead, let each of us say, I need to work on any number of things, and maybe others can help me work on it. Maybe we can work on these things together. We as a congregation can break out in revival because we are allowing you to transform us by the truth of your word. Again, I thank you for Jesus Christ and for the death that he died on Calvary, that provision he made for us that we could never do for ourselves. By faith in Jesus, through the grace that he showed and the love that was exhibited, we can be forgiven. And I thank you for that. If anyone here needs that forgiveness, I pray that they would step forward and say, yes, I need that. And they'd find somebody this morning in this place that could talk to them about it. And I praise you that we've had these moments together today. I'm trusting you, Father, that the silence toward the end of the service here was because you were working and we were thinking. And I pray now that you'd get all the glory and praise for it, Father, please. And we pray it in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, Amen.